I have to run. Oh, there we go. So,
we appreciate you being here.
well, thank you. It's nothing you said, but directly after my talk today, I got to run because I have a funeral mass to do after this one at that parish. And
I will tell you thank you now.
okay, thank you all for putting up with me. Whenever you're ready, Dina Marie, you can let me be ready.
Okay, is everybody ready? Yes.
All right. Ooh. I'm sorry. It's a little loud. There we go. Testing 1 2 3. Testing 1 2 3. Is that okay? Great. Okay. Now, finally, today, this is the last lecture with me. You're going to hear about the three-handed Madonna. So you're going to get the story. And these don't work. Okay. You'd think by now I'd know that. I told you before that we always say the year 600, but around the year 600, Muhammad has his first vision that led to the founding of Islam. Now, this movement very quickly united the many pagan tribes around the area of Mecca and Medina. And one of the great pushes in this movement was the Holy War, the Hajj. Jihad, rather. Hajj is a pilgrimage. Sorry about that. Didn't mean that. They conquered all the Arab areas, including the Christians that were in those areas, because there were a lot of Christians in Syria. The Nestorian church was there. The other Syriac churches were there. And then it started spreading violently through the Mideast and conquered many areas, swaths of areas that had been Byzantine Christian. So the Byzantine Empire was beginning to shrink. And one of the areas that they took over almost immediately was the north of Africa. So that was why the Monophysite heresy never was able to reconcile with the Orthodox Church, because they became under the aegis of Islam instead of Constantinople. That meant they also lost their breadbasket, because that was the major corn producer for the Byzantine Empire. Now this meant that the armies of Byzantium all of a sudden were losing most of the battles that they were involved in. And they had not been used to losing battles. I mean, you'd lose a few and then you go back in. But now they're finding less and less territory belongs them. And this alarmed, shall we say, the administration there. Because this was what it was that led to a period of suppressing the use of icons under the Emperor Leo III, the Iusarian. This was beginning in 726. Now, he came from an area that was heavily influenced, in the Mideast, heavily influenced by Jewish and other faiths that were against images. And this was a part of the church in that area that never really caught on to the idea of using images. Some of them did, most of them didn't. And they were very cautious about how they would use icons from there. So Leo, coming from that area, and he wasn't of the royal lineage. He was just a very successful general at one point, and that's why they picked him to be emperor. That's Leo the Isarian, or Leo III. Now in 726, he began a program and began dialogues with the patriarch at that time, and this is St. Germanus, about getting rid of icons. And he then petitioned the Pope as well to try to get him to come along with him. Well, this was not a fight that Rome had any idea about. First of all, they didn't use icons for the most part. Some of our earliest icons are in Rome, and that's why they were saved. Our Lady Salvation of All the People, or if you go to the old Jewish quarter, there is a church of St. Mary there where they used to drag all of the Jews once a year to have a sermon about how bad they were and how they should turn into Christians. And so it was not a nice history for that, but there's one of the largest and most beautiful Madonna and Child in the Church of St. Mary in that area. Okay, so the Pope said no, not interested. St. Germanus refused to budge. So the emperor had him condemned, thrown out of the patriarchate, and put his own man into it because he wanted to impose iconoclasm. Now, where did I put that? Oh, well, I brought a relic for you, but I can't seem to find it. It's probably in my room where I shouldn't be. At any rate, his first act in 730 was to issue a decree condemning the use of icons. That was in 730. And the first act from this was to destroy an image. Now, some people say it was a statue. I had never heard that before, but I found one author who says it was a statue of Christ. Most people think of it as being a mosaic of the Pantocrator above the entrance to the imperial palace. So there was someone was sent to climb a ladder and to destroy this image, whether it was a mosaic or whether it was in the round. The people loved this image. So very soon, a huge crowd gathered in front of the palace, booing and throwing things. And then there was this woman. This is St. Theodora. She was a nun. And that's whose relics I brought, but I cannot see where I put them. Sigh. And she went over and started shaking the ladder until the man fell off and broke his neck. She was then arrested and put to death. So she became the first martyr for iconoclasm for an act of murder. But it was the public sense of her fire that made them immediately declare her a saint, because their images were being destroyed and they didn't have anything to do with that.
And what was his reasoning? What reason did he give why he wanted that done?
Well, the major reason was that they were losing wars. And his idea was that since he was from an area where you didn't use icons, it was people worshiping icons that was making God turn against them. Because in Islam, you're not allowed religious images. You don't, at least in the beginning, you don't paint the human figure. And so he was thinking that God was favoring Islam because they weren't breaking the commandment of Exodus. He also, his theologians also declared that this was a vestige of paganism, worshiping these images and so forth. So those are the reasons that he went against the icons. But it was mainly because he was losing wars, and he was afraid God was mad at the Byzantines for this use of icons. Well,
just to clarify, Father, when you say worshiping images, they didn't really worship them. They just honored
yes, they did. They did worship them, but not what you're thinking of. Oh, bless you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. This is a relic of bone of St. Theodora, this woman. So, let's see, I'll put that in front.
We have the same kind of temperament.
Mm-hmm. Whoops. Get in there. There we go. So, St. Theodora. Now, this suppression of icons, we call it iconoclasm, icon breaking in Greek, lasted for a little bit more than 100 years. And it can be divided into two periods. The first period, depending on whether you want to take it from the beginning, 726, when he began to talk about getting rid of images, or if you want to take it from 730, from when the first decree went out, to 787. Now, in 787, the emperor at that time died, and his wife was St. Irene. She was a iconodule, an icon lover, and I'll answer your question in just a second. I don't want to forget that. And she brought back, and she restored the use of icons, brought in, deposed the patriarch who was an iconoclast, and brought in another patriarch who favored the use of icons. So then there was a period of about 27 years when icons were again okay. The second period began after these 27 years of peace. Now, the Emperor Leo the Armenian, remember we started with Leo the Assyrian, now this one is Leo V the Armenian. He decided that the iconoclastic emperors were obviously more successful on the field than iconodules. So he's still looking at their inability to win wars, and they're losing territory to Islam. So this is obviously still God angry at the Byzantine Empire. And in 815, a new age of iconoclasm was inaugurated under Leo the Armenian. This one was not as intense. There wasn't the great destruction of icons, and it's due to iconoclasm that we have very few images from the early church. The only images that we have that we would call icons in the historical sense were from the 600s. And there are only about 7 of those, and most of those were saved in St. Catherine's monastery near Mount Sinai, because they were outside the Byzantine Empire. They were in an area that had been taken by Islam. Islam didn't care what the Christians were doing as long as they paid a special tax to remain Christian. So if you live in an Islam area to this day and you are a Christian, or you belong to some other religion that is allowed by Islam, because Islam does not allow all religions. It only allows religions that have a book. So we and the Jews have the Bible. Some religions, like the fire worshippers, the Zoroastrians, they suddenly had books, which they'd never had before. So if you had a book, if you had the tombs of your prophets, if you could show that there was an ancient age to your church, then you were allowed, as long as you paid your tax. Now, as to your question, there is two different, Greeks love to split everything, okay? So there is worship that is given to God. And that is a specific kind of worship. But there is also worship, a lesser kind, which is more what we would call giving honor to saints, icons, and so forth. It's probably my breath. What am I rubbing? I didn't. There we go. Okay. So there's these two different kinds. Now, like in the Roman understanding of God, there are many gods. There were the Olympian gods, and then there were sort of little lesser gods that became gods. But then there were also the divine ones, the Dewi, and which is where our word from God comes, Dewi. And those are people who have the potential to enter into the heavenly realm and become worshipped. So heroes like Hercules, then when he died, was then brought into the imperial pantheon and became a god. Not an Olympian god. He's not given the same honor as that, but he is a lesser god. Now, and that gave two different kinds of worship. One is called doula, and one is, I've forgotten what, do you remember what the other one is? There are two different terms in theology, so you can look that up yourself. Pardon? Hyperdulia or latria? Latria and dulia. Those are the two different kinds. And they made that distinction in Christianity as well. The dulia was for the Godhead. You would worship the Trinity, but you wouldn't give that dulia to the saints or to relics or to icons. That would be latria. I think I got that right. Or is that switched? No, latria is the divine worship. Dulia is for this. I don't use those terms very often, so sorry about that. Does that help? So you can say, and many of the writers will say, worshiping the icons as a positive thing. Others will use it as a negative thing because they're thinking of latria, whereas the Orthodox are thinking dulia. Okay? And they make very distinct pronouncements about which is which. Now, after that first period, it was ended by the Seventh Ecumenical Council. And this was before the 27 years of peace. And at that council, they defined the use of icons in worship and in liturgy. Well, I guess that's the same thing. And this council held until after the 27 years, in which case the new emperor, Leo, ignored those, had his own council. Way fewer bishops arrived at that one, and they allowed the destruction again. But they also allowed private devotion. So they were not as intense as the first area of iconoclasm. They brought out the old arguments against icons, nothing new, whereas the church had defined it in the Seventh Ecumenical Council, and they continued during that period defining and protecting. So, in 1815, when the new age of iconoclasm was inaugurated, there was trouble in the empire. In 848, the Emperor Theophilus, he was the last of the iconoclasts, he died, and his son, Michael, was way too young to rule. I think he was about 8 or 10 at this point. And his empress, Theodora, became the regent for the empire. So she was now in charge, and she was an iconodule. She was an icon lover. So in 843, she called, how was that 843? Anyway, she called a new council, which confirmed the teaching of the Seventh Council before, canceling out the in-between Little Council, because it was not an ecumenical council, according to the Orthodox. It was a robber council, like the one that condemned John Chrysostom many centuries before that. And they confirmed the teaching of the Seventh Council, and this the Eighth Council, regarding icons, and inaugurated a feast in the Orthodox Church called the Triumph of Orthodoxy, which to this day is still celebrated. The Triumph of Orthodoxy is still celebrated in the Orthodox Church on the first Sunday of Lent. And I meant it. The icon, a new icon was then brought to bear, which had an image of the Hodegetria on a stand over an altar, and on either side of it are the emperor and empress and her son Michael, and a number of the iconodule bishops and saints. And that is the technical icon for the Feast of Orthodoxy. So, now this brings us, and that was during the Great Lent. In other words, Lent we would also call Lent. It was during this time of the first persecution that a man by the name of John Damascene, or John of Damascus, came into prominence. Now, he was born around 645, and he died around 749. Dates back then were a little vague. Now, the interesting thing here is his family name was Mansur, which in Arabic means victorious. But the current emperor at his time, who was Constantine V Copronymus, that's an important term, Copronymus, and I'll tell you why, was incensed at the success of John's writings. John was a voluminous writer. His writings in defense enraged the emperor, who began to call him not Mansur, but began calling him John Mamzur, which in Arabic means the bastard John. Well, no one like Constantine Copronymus should ever take someone's name to task, because the term Copronymus, which he bore throughout his life, indicated something that happened during his baptism. Anybody know what a coprolite is? A coprolite? It is a piece of fossilized dinosaur poop, but it comes from copra. Copronymus can tell you what happened at the baptismal font. So during the ceremony, he soiled the water of the baptismal font, and so he got known as Copronymus for the rest of his life and throughout history. So this guy should not be touching anybody else's names. Now, John, he belonged to a family of career ministers to the rulers in Damascus, starting under the Byzantine rule, and then after the Arab conquest of Damascus in 636, his family then took up the same posts under Islam. Islam understood and valued education because they were not educated, at least not at this point. They were warriors. And so here they found people who could take up the taxes, do the accounting. They found people who could write the letters, people who knew the languages of the other rulers in the world. And so they valued them and kept them on, if they hadn't killed them during the conquest, kept them on in many of the posts that they had had before. John was one of these. Now, he was fluent in Arabic and Greek and was also very knowledgeable about Islam. He saw it coming and he studied it. So he was a perfect government servant for Islam, but a very devout Christian. Now, when the Caliph, you don't have to write this one down, Abd al-Malik, which means son of the king, and he was the Caliph from 685 to 705, he turned hostile against the Christians. This was sometime between 700 and 724. We're not exactly sure when it started. But between those periods, 700 to 724, John could not in conscience continue working for him. So he resigned his civil offices, and then he went, and outside Jerusalem, he entered into a monastery, Mar Saba, which is there today. It's about 25 miles outside of Jerusalem in the middle of really arid desert. When iconoclasm broke out again in 726, John became one of the chief apologists for the use of icons, both in the church and in private devotion. Now, how could you be with an emperor who's going against icons, how could you then write in defense of them and not expect to get smacked? John could because he was outside the Byzantine Empire. He was under the Islamic Empire. So he was perfectly safe to be able to say what he wanted about icons because they didn't care. The Islamic folk didn't care about icons. And so he could defend many different questions of theology, but particularly this idea of icons. He wrote 3 particular letters about the use of icons. Now, he was a fluent preacher and a voluminous writer, as I said. His style was simple and often copied the arguments of those who came before him. We would have called it plagiarism, but that was not what they called it back in those days. It was just standard procedure. You saw something you liked, you took it and put it in. You usually didn't give anybody credit for it except yourself. However, he had a style that was very simple and easy to understand, so he could appeal to a broad, popular audience, as opposed to the very learned theologians who did not care what the hoi polloi thought, but was rather much more interested in getting the guys with deep pockets on their side. We have about 150 works of John of Damascus, that are very definitely his, all historians agree these belong to him. But there's a whole trove of others that are supposed to be by him. So if you want a job, there is, and you can learn Greek, there is a lot of work to be done on the other writings to find and decide which ones were by John of Damascus and maybe who they were written by if they weren't by John. He wrote in Greek in defense of icons, and his most celebrated work of all, and this is not just about icons, there's a little bit about icons in it, is called The Source of Knowledge, and it's a huge compendium in 3 sections that covers all kinds of theology. This is one part of the first part. And in this, you're going to see him defending the earlier councils. So listen for words that we talked about in the last couple of days. The Father is Father and unbegotten. The Son is Son, begotten, and not unbegotten. Okay, so he's saying, he's hitting areas. The Son is begotten of the Father, which is what we say in the Creed. For he is from the Father. So that same essence argument. The Holy Spirit is not begotten, but he proceeds. Remember we say in the Creed that the Holy Spirit proceeds. We say the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, but he says, but he proceeds, for he is from the Father. So as the original says. There is nothing here of creature, nor a second, first, or servant-master relationship. There is, however, unity and Trinity, and it was and is and will be unto the ages. So forever, amen. Understood and adored by faith, and not through inquiry, nor investigation, nor demonstration. So he's obviously referring to people like Augustine, who tried to figure out how they could explain the Trinity. He's saying you can't. For as much as you seek, so much the more ignorant will you be. And as much as you pry into it, so much the more it will be hidden. Let God, therefore, be adored by the faithful without meddlesome calculation. In other words, step back theologians. Believe that God is in 3 persons. Believe that God is in 3 persons. How this is beyond explaining. For God is not to be comprehended. Let God therefore be adored. God is not to be comprehended. In other words, we adore God, we're never going to be able to understand the mystery and immensity of God. We can just stand in awe. Yes?
Is he the first to write this way about the Trinity?
Not the first, but yeah, the first one to put it in such a form. There are a lot of people that said it's mystery. That's what Augustine finally came up with, that we can't go beyond. We can reach a certain point, and we can't go beyond. We can describe, but we cannot understand. And so John has taken this, and because there's still a lot of wrangling in theology. If they can't deal with icons, they're going to deal with something else. So there were a lot of theologians that were trying to explain something that they wouldn't get killed for. So they were really keeping their jobs by trying to figure out Trinity and other mysteries of the church. And he's saying, step back. Step back. This is not something that you can do.
I grew up listening to the nuns saying that. That was their first go-to. It's the mystery of God. It's the mystery of faith.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are things that we can delve into, but we just have to reach a point and say, okay, the rest of it's God's, not mine. This mind can only do a little fraction because this mind came from God. So how can something like this comprehend the one that made us? And as we look at the stars, we're this new telescope out there that is showing us wonders beyond wonders. God did all of that. He made those billions of galaxies. So how am I going to understand that on this little piece of creation? Now,
My grandkids can't get past who made God?
Right.
You know?
You-
It's hard to explain it to them.
Yeah, because they always, your grandkids want to know who made God because they can't, the idea of never beginning.
Right. They can't picture that.
No. Nowadays, how long is the attention span of the average person? About 5 minutes, unless they're waiting for the commercial. So they want a quick answer. And like John says, there is no quick answer. There is no answer at all. It is the incomprehensibility of God. Now, about the icon. Leo, remember Leo, Leo Copronymus? Well, he was outraged at the writings of John, particularly the ones in defense of the icon. And so he couldn't touch him. And John was already at Marsaba. So he wrote a letter to the caliph because he knew that John had worked for the caliph until he left and became a monk. And he started telling the caliph what a good friend he was. They hated each other. What a good friend he was, because he wanted to save him from a snake at his breast. While you had this man working for you, he was sending me reports and spying on you. And I, your great friend, I, your brother, need you to know about how dangerous this man is to you. Well, the caliph was furious when he read this, and he dispatched some soldiers to John and had them cut off his right hand, because that was the hand that he was writing with. John picked up the hand and went to his favorite icon, which was the icon of the Hodegetria. And he poured out his heart in front of her. How am I going to defend the faith of your son if I cannot write? Lady, have mercy on me. And the legend is that the Madonna then reached out from the icon, picked up his hand, and reattached it to his arm. And then John could continue writing. And it was in gratitude of that John had a silver hand made as a votive, as an offering. Just like when you go into Italian and Mexican churches or any church in Europe and you see a particularly important Madonna, or Mexico, and you see the walls covered with silver pieces, like there'll be eyes and there'll be breasts and there'll be hands and there'll be noses. And those are things that people gave in thanksgiving for having been healed through the intercession of their favorite Madonna or child or whatever saint is up there. This is the same thing. This is where this comes from. And so he hung this, and if you look closely at this, there's the third hand right there, hanging downward from a chain around her neck. Well, after he died, and then more icons like this were being made, there was this third hand. Nobody knew what to do with it because that story had been forgotten. And that's why you have them coming up, coming in, coming over, wherever they could find space to put them in. It's just a total forgetting of this legend. But that is the story of why there is a three-handed Madonna. Now let's go back to some of John's writings. There are two things I want to give you. Now you've already seen him talking about the Trinity. Well, how about the Incarnation, since that's been the centerpiece of what we've been doing? He wrote, "The incarnate Son of God, who was born of Mary, was not a divinely inspired man." And this is what some of the heretical movements were saying, that Jesus was just a man who at the baptism was overshadowed by the Holy Spirit and then became the Son of God. So he was not God the way God the Father was God. He was a divinely inspired man. But John says he was not divinely inspired, but God incarnate. Must she not, therefore, be mother of God, who bore God incarnate? Certainly, She who performed the role of the Creator's handmaid and mother is truly and in perfect reality God's mother and lady and queen over all creation. Because of the incarnation, all of this comes to her, not because of any innate power that she has, but the gift of God because she has borne God. And just as he that was conceived kept her that conceived a virgin, he that was born kept her virginity intact, only passing through her and keeping her closed. Again, the story in Protovangelium of the intact hymen. The conception was through the sense of hearing, but the birth was through the usual channel by which children come. That sound odd enough? Yep. Well, if you look at a lot of icons, and I've looked at a lot of icons, you will very often note, and also in the West, in the Italo-Byzantine tradition, Fra Angelico being a good one, you will find that the rays coming from the dove, as the angel is speaking to Mary in the Annunciation, are headed toward her ear. Because that was how the word was imparted, by the message of the angel and the overshadowing of the Spirit. Therefore, that's what John is referring to, is when Mary heard these things, it was true hearing. And hearing in the Greek conception is not just, you're hearing my words, but rather hearing the word, or hearing God's messenger, or hearing Scripture. It engages you. It's not just a passive receiving of sound. It's an engagement, it is a conversation, it is a response. So it's an activity rather than a passivity. So that's why he says, through the sense of hearing. Even if some do prattle of his birth being through the side of the mother of God, again, trying to keep her virgin. I've never heard that legend anywhere else, that it was from the side of Mary. Certainly, it was not impossible for him to come by this gate, the virginal conception, without injuring its seal in any way. So it certainly wasn't impossible for him to pass through and keep her virgin. Thus, the ever-virgin remains after birth a virgin still, never having consorted with man until death. For how were it possible that she who had borne God and had come to know that miracle from her experience of subsequent events, being the mother of God, should receive the embrace of a man? So in other words, if you have had this amazing experience of the Godhead, how could you ever lower yourself to an earthly plane? Perish the thought, is his last word. As you can tell, John this is putting a lot of theology in a very understandable way. Because, again, he was trying for the masses. He was trying to get the hearts of the people that loved God. Now, since we've been talking about John as a defender of images, I'll give you just a short piece from his first letter about the use of images. We would certainly be in error if we were making an image of the invisible God. For what is incorporeal and invisible and uncircumscribable and without defined figure is not able to be depicted. So he's agreeing to one of the arguments that they were throwing against icons. We cannot make an image of something we cannot see. And we cannot see the divinity of God. That's one of the reasons that they didn't allow the image of the Father to be the old bearded man that we're so used to in Western iconography. In the Eastern iconography, it wasn't until way, way, way later when they began to be influenced by the Western tradition, sometime in, say, the 1400s, that they began to show the image of the Father in icons. And again, if we were making images of men and thought them gods, and we adored them as gods, Certainly we would be impious. This is again one of the arguments that they were going to icons as the pagans went to their images. Certainly we would be impious, but we do not do any of these things. We worship and adore the Creator and Maker alone, as God who by his nature is to be worshipped. We worship also, Dulia, we worship also the Holy Mother of God, not as God, but as God's mother according to the flesh. So within her womb came forth the body of the Christ who is God and man. Moreover, we worship also the saints, Dulia, as elect friends of God, and as having gotten ready audience with God. So they are in a place to be able to pray for us. And so therefore our going to them makes for John a great deal of sense, because they are in the divine presence. They have access to the ear of the Lord. Why would we not want to talk to God's friends to give us help? Remember, people are still looking at that image of Jesus, Pantocrator, as a parallel, if you will, to the emperor. And they're afraid to approach the emperor. You do something wrong, you're dead. So Christ is a little inaccessible to most people. So they go to Mary and they go to the saints, because, you know, if you want to get the ear of somebody, you go to his mom and say, could you ask Jerry to... And that's what they're doing here, because the common people, in fear of the empire, because look what the empire was doing to them and had done to them and ruined their icons already, here they can approach the friends of God to intercede for them. But that's Dulia. So, this is John talking about his reasonings behind why icons are possible. We don't worship icons. Icons are an encounter. Icons are an encounter. As I told you before, you remember the vanishing point? Well, instead of back here behind me, the vanishing point in an icon includes you, so that you are part of the icon. And therefore you can engage the icon in conversation, in love, in dealing with your issues and bringing them to whomever that icon is about. Whether it is an icon of Christ, whether it is an icon of Mary, whether it is an icon of our holy murderess here, or anybody else, St. Patrick, St. whomever. Because we engage, because they engage us. We don't believe that they have power by themselves, nor does an icon have power by itself, except the power that God sends through the icon, and to bring us the kind of healing, the kind of hope, the kind of love that we need to live. So in the Orthodox tradition and in the Eastern Catholic tradition, icons are liturgical. They are part of every worship that is done in the church, and they are also personal. So when you go into a house, of a Byzantine house, Orthodox or Catholic, traditionally you would not greet a husband or wife first, whoever came to the door. First you would look up into the corner of the entrance hall and greet your true host, because there would almost always be an icon. So you bow to them, and then you say hello to your earthly hosts. In church, when you go in, as I told you, the first thing you see is the icon of the Pantocrator. Then you enter into the church, and the Pantocrator is again in the dome, so he is blessing and calling everyone. And behind the altar on the apse wall is that icon of Our Lady of the Sign, holding, well, not holding, but the Christ is in her womb, but outside blessing you. because he is just beginning his work always as you encounter him. It's a new beginning every time. And then as you leave, you get to say goodbye to Our Lady in the Dormition icon and the crucifixion. And there'll be lots of icons scattered around everywhere. So you see people while whenever the iconostasis is closed, that's that great screen, people will be going around saying hello to their favorite friends, their saints, by honoring the icons again. That's why they do that. That's part of their worship, because these are the friends of the Lord, and they are also gathered. They're not just out there somewhere. I mean, when we go to Mass here, we're concentrated on the altar. But there are statues, there's stained glass, and so forth. But we put that aside. The Orthodox do not. For them, that is a living part of the worship that they are now doing. Okay? Does that make sense? Or at least is that understandable? Okay. Well, we have a few minutes left, and I wondered if you might have some questions. I would certainly be surprised if you didn't. Anyone?
Yeah, you talked about, how they said it's impossible for us to have an understanding of God.
Right, a complete understanding of God.
And as you were saying, it seems to me that to try to do that would be to be like Adam and Eve, trying to gain all knowledge.
Right. The comment was, I'm doing this for them. The comment was not able to understand God, to comprehend God, and trying to do that would be like becoming like Adam and Eve, to eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge and of good and evil. So that going outside our bounds and going outside whom God has called us to be, to try to comprehend God, not a good idea. Not a good idea. Got us into this trouble to begin with. Anyone else?
Are icons, I guess the name, different than, say, paintings on the walls of a church or whatever?
Yes, those are frescoes, but frescoes can be icons. It's just a different tradition of how to paint them. An icon is on wood, usually on gesso, and transportable. Whereas a fresco, you paint directly on the third layer of plaster, which is the sweet layer. And when you don't use egg tempera, you just use water with the pigment, because there is a chemical reaction between the pigment, and as the plaster hardens, it creates a layer of pigment on the surface, so that it is protected on the surface by that chemical reaction, which sets up a barrier. That's why they can last for so long. It's also why they're also carved into so many times, like in Cappadocia, half of them are scratched through, because Muslims who didn't like all those images would come in and scratch out the eyes, usually, of anybody that was there. And it's the churches that were tall enough that saved most of the icons, because they're way up there and that was too much trouble, so they left that. But anything close down, that was out of the question. They were going to get hurt. Is that answer? Yes. Okay, yeah, so it's a fresco, but that can also be an icon. In fact, if you go to just below Hillsborough is Santa Ana? Anyway, there's a town there that has a wonderful Orthodox church, a Russian Orthodox church there. And Father Patrick, who is a monk in the north of California, and I usually know the name of the town that he's in, but anyway, he has been coming down for years and frescoing that church. They would get a certain amount of money to be able to pay for all of the stuff that they needed. For instance, he had gone up and put the sketch, the cartoon of the Christ Pantocrator with many angels in the dome, but then they didn't have enough money to keep the scaffolding up. So they had to take it down, and for years that just stayed up as a cartoon. It was absolutely beautiful. And then they finally were able to put enough money together to rebuild the scaffolding. And so he finished that, and then all around the church, normally over the iconostasis, there would be a layer of feasts. So you have the 16 major feasts of the church. Well, he started doing those larger than life size around the outside walls, or the inside walls of the church. And he didn't have enough room to do all 16 there, but he's putting up, I think, about 10 or 12. They're amazing. It's the Holy Protection, but it has a much longer name than that because it's also dedicated to one of the Russian saints. So I'd have to look it up again. I wasn't expecting to talk about it.
There's a Greek Orthodox church in Portland.
Yes, Holy Trinity.
Have you been there?
Oh, yes.
They have icons.
They have icons. They don't have the whole church done in icons, but they do, and they have a great iconostasis. There are other icons around. Yeah, it's a beautiful church. There's also another Orthodox church, I believe it's Armenian, St. George, in town as well, that has an amazing set of icons. They just did a new iconostasis, so it's well worth going around. Take a look in your Google Orthodox churches in Portland and just take a trip. Make sure they're open. There's a little one out near St. Rita as well, another Orthodox, very small Orthodox church, very humble. Yeah.
Okay. How can we tell, now this is a question about Eastern Rite churches,
Mhm.
icons. How can we tell as Roman Catholics which ones of the Byzantine or Orthodox or Eastern churches
Mhm.
are in line with the Holy Father so that we can go to their liturgies and receive communion? How can we tell?
Because the sign out front will say Catholic.
Or what, 'cause my girlfriend joined Russian.
Yeah, there's, if you go to St.
Not in line with the Pope.
Well, those would be Orthodox,
Okay.
and they would not have Catholic on their name. But for instance, if you go to a Chaldean church, it will always say the Chaldean Catholic Church of, or the Chaldean Catholic Cathedral, and so forth. So it'll always have Catholic in the title, except the Maronites, because the Maronites have never had an Orthodox branch. They're the only Eastern church that never left communion with Rome. And that was the work of St. Maron, after whom they're called. They'd been in existence for hundreds of years before Maron, but Maron was the one who made sure they didn't get caught up in Nestorianism or in Monophysitism or one of the other heterodox movements. So they're the only church you don't have to worry about. If it's Maronite, you're fine. But all the other Catholic churches, Eastern Catholic churches, will have that in their title. They're very proud of it, and they want to make sure you know that. And the Orthodox will make sure they don't have it on theirs.
Same here. I got to attend a Ukrainian Catholic Mass with a friend in the early 90s in Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
There were icons everywhere.
Oh, yeah.
And we received communion in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't flat and
No, they cut a little piece of a... In the Byzantine Rite, they take a little cake that is made for each liturgy. There's a large cake for the priest, and then the people who are going to receive communion, or the people who want to honor whoever the Mass is being offered for, the priest will then take a little tiny spear, and he will cut a triangle out of each one of those loaves and put it on the paten. And that will be the bread that's going to be used for the Eucharist. That is then poured into the chalice of the blood. And then when you come up for communion, they take a spoon and they dip in and bring out the bread soaked in the wine and place that on your tongue. So you don't put out your hands. But now if you went to a church of the East and the Assyrians, not Catholic, in using a traditional rite, you would receive the bread separately from the wine, but you would receive the bread in your hand. And this is what we're trying to do in the West, although everybody's coming like this, but you make a throne in your hand by making a cross, and that is what you receive the Christ on. And then you go to the cup, and depending on that particular parish, they will either spoon or they will give you the cup itself.
I remember you opened your mouth in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
A
cloth to hold under.
Okay.
This was cloth?
Mm-hmm. But I remember in the little program they gave us, there were 45 Lord have mercy.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. It's that chant over and over and over again. It's calling out to God asking for peace, asking for mercy, asking for healing. Yeah, you'll find a lot of Lord have mercies. Jesus' prayer, yep. That comes from the Hesychast movement, which is a type of spirituality and meditation. So as you say the name of Jesus, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me, a sinner. Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me, a sinner. Sort of like the rosary, and they use a rosary to count this. Not the traditional rosary, but just a long string of beads with a cross on it. Both the Orthodox and the Catholics will use that. And they just repeat this over and over again until it seeps into your soul. That's the idea, that the more you repeat it, the more it becomes embedded in you, and you become part of it. Yeah, Jesus' prayer.
Have you ever taken one of the prints of icons
Mm-hmm.
and applied gold sheet to it?
You can. I haven't. But yeah, you could do that easily. You can gold leaf almost anything. You can gold leaf lamps and
It seems like
picture frames.
the gold, like you talked about, especially around like the halo,
Mhm.
it comes out, and I love the idea with the icons that you had here, that you can kind of see through them, but
Mhm.
you can almost imagine that if you had like the perspective of the shiny.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, you can easily do that, and you can do it inexpensively if you want, because there are fake golds that you can buy at art stores and stuff, and they'll give you the size to put it down, and then you can just lay it on there, and it will hold. And so you don't do the much greater expense of buying a book of gold. But yeah, there's no reason, because I've attached it to paper in an explanation of the gilding process. But I've never done it just to a paper icon, although I've seen paper icons with gold halos, yeah. Yep.
Are there any known Eucharistic miracles within the Eastern Byzantine Orthodox?
Multitudes. Multitudes. They expect that there's going to be something amazing happening. So when a miracle happens in the middle of a service, nobody's surprised, and also with the Eucharist. Sometimes it was a miracle of the person not being able to approach the Eucharist. There was a Mary of Egypt, for instance. She was shall we say, a courtesan in Alexandria. Very famous, very wealthy, and she heard about this pilgrimage to Jerusalem. They said, oh, great, a vacation, fine. So she went along, and she, of course, seduced all the men on the way to the pilgrimage. That was how she was paying her bills. And she got to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where they were showing the relic of the true cross, and she couldn't enter the door. She got up to it, and it was like slamming into an invisible wall. And she realized it was because of her sin, that she was not able to enter into the Holy of Holies. So she found somebody, confessed, then went into the church, went to the liturgy, received communion, and then went off to the desert and became a hermit. And there's the story of Pachomius, who was one of the great early monastic saints. How are we doing? Oh, we're out of time. Yep. So I'm going to have to not answer any more of that. But look that one up, because that's a really good one. St. Mary of Egypt and Pachomius. Well, thank you all very much. It's been a delight to be with you. And it really wasn't anything you said, but I'm leaving.
Do you teach at a university or anything? Or at a high school? Or anywhere?
No, not really.
Wow.
I teach